200 Comanche warriors don't just ride up to your barn by accident. They come for blood, for justice, or for war. The morning sun cut through the prairie haze, turning the tall grass to gold. From the porch of a weathered ranch house, a lone man stood, one hand resting on the worn grip of a Colt Navy at his hip. His eyes narrowed as the riders emerged from the horizon like a dark tide. Hoofbeats thundered through the earth, shaking the windows. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe. The lead rider carried a spear tipped with eagle feathers and strips of red cloth that fluttered in the dry wind. They weren't coming to trade. They weren't coming to talk. But this wasn't where it began. It started 2 weeks earlier, on a day so still and hot it felt like the whole prairie had stopped breathing. Ethan Callahan was a man who'd long since learned to keep to himself. Out on the edge of Comanche territory, silence was safer than conversation. He was 38, with sunburnt skin and a jaw roughened by a week's stubble. His days were measured in fence posts, water troughs, and the slow, unending rhythm of ranch work. The ranch sat alone, miles from town, miles from neighbors. Just him, a pair of old mules, and the occasional distant howl of coyotes at night. He wasn't much for company anymore. Once, years ago, he'd had a wife, a boy, but a fever had swept through the valley one bitter winter and taken them both, leaving Ethan with a house that echoed too loud and nights that never felt warm again. That afternoon, he'd been patching the south fence when he heard it. Just a sound at first, soft and broken. A cry carried by the wind. Ethan froze. Out here, there weren't supposed to be voices. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and stepped quietly toward the mesquite trees lining the dry creek bed. The sound came again, weak, desperate. At the bottom of the creek bed, half hidden in the dust and brush, lay a girl. Her dress was torn, her moccasins gone. She couldn't have been more than 17. Blood stained her shoulder, dark and sticky where an arrowhead still jutted out. Her eyes cracked open at his shadow. They were black as obsidian, wide with fear. She whispered something in a language Ethan didn't understand, her voice so faint it barely carried. Ethan stared down at her, every instinct screaming at him to walk away. This was Comanche land. Helping her meant trouble, trouble that could burn a man's life to the ground. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of every story he'd ever heard in town. Stories of settlers who took in the wrong person, only to find themselves hunted by a whole war party days later. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to turn around. Pretend he never saw her. But then her hand twitched toward him. Not begging, not grabbing, just reaching. Ethan looked at that hand for a long time. Weathered skin against skin that had never held a rifle, never broken a horse. "Damn it," he muttered. He knelt beside her. The girl flinched when he touched the arrow, her teeth clenched tight. She tried to pull away, weak but still proud, still fierce. "Easy," he said softly. "Ain't here to hurt you." She didn't understand the words, but she stopped fighting. He broke the arrow's shaft, lifted her carefully into his arms. She weighed nothing at all, bones and bruises and a stubborn heartbeat still hanging on. The walk back to the ranch felt longer than any trail he'd ever taken. Every step, Ethan expected to hear war cries behind him, hoofs pounding after him. But the land stayed silent. By the time he laid her on the rough bed in his small cabin, sweat soaked through his shirt. He worked quietly, boiling water, cleaning the wound, stitching it with hands that hadn't sewn anything since his wife's last dress. She didn't cry, didn't beg, just stared at him with those dark, unblinking eyes as though memorizing his face. That night, Ethan sat at the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the floorboards. He knew what would happen if word got out. The men in town wouldn't call it kindness. They'd call it betrayal. And if her people found out he'd taken her in, Ethan didn't finish the thought. He glanced at her again, lying there pale and still, her lips dry, her breathing shallow but steady. Outside, the wind had picked up. The first coyotes of the night began to howl, their cries echoing across the empty prairie. Ethan leaned back, ran a hand over his face, and muttered to no one, "What the hell have I done?" Somewhere far out on the plains, unseen in the moonlight, A drumbeat answered. Slow, measured, growing closer. Ethan woke before sunrise, the way ranchers do, out of habit more than choice. But that morning felt different. The cabin was quiet except for the soft, uneven breathing of the girl on his bed. He knelt beside her, checking the wound. The bleeding had slowed, but the skin around it was angry and red. She needed more than he could give her, more than a half-empty bottle of whiskey and some boiled cloth could manage. He poured her a little water, holding the cup to her lips. She sipped weakly, her gaze never leaving his face. There was no fear in her eyes now, only exhaustion. Yeah, Ethan murmured. I'm still here. By mid-morning, he saddled up the mule and rode into town. He kept his head down, buying only what he needed, bandages, herbs, and some tinned food. But the shopkeeper, Henry Talbot, had a way of asking questions without asking questions. You patchin' up strays again, Callahan? Henry said, ringing up the supplies. Ethan forced a small grin. Just a scrape. Cut my hand on some wire. Henry's eyes narrowed. Funny how that wire keeps cutting you year after year. Ethan didn't answer. When he stepped out of the store, two men were sitting outside on the porch, whittling sticks and watching him. Tom Avery, a rancher from up north, and his younger brother, Luke. You heard what happened? Luke said as Ethan passed. Ethan stopped. What happened? Bunch of ranch hands found a Comanche camp couple miles west, Tom said. Half burned. Lot of bodies. Guess some Kiowa boys didn't like sharing the hunting grounds. Luke spit into the dust. One of their young uns is still missin'. Bet they're blammin' us already. Ethan said nothing, just tipped his hat and walked away, feeling the weight of their stares on his back. By the time he got home, the girl was awake, propped weakly on one elbow. She watched him unpack the supplies, her eyes sharp despite her weakness. He set a tin of peaches on the table and opened it with his knife. She ate slowly, careful not to waste a drop. That night, Ethan sat outside on the porch, rolling a cigarette he wouldn't smoke. His neighbor, Clara Hayes, rode up just before dusk. She was a widow with 2 boys and a sharp tongue. You been busy, she said, sliding off her horse. Ethan frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Henry Talbot told me what you bought in town. Ain't no barbed wire wound that needs that much stitchin'. Ethan didn't answer. Clara sighed, looking past him toward the cabin window where a faint light flickered. You know what folks'll say if they find out, Ethan. They'll think you're talking sides. And if her people come ridin' in the night, I'll deal with it. Clara shook her head. You can't fix the whole damn world by yourself. He glanced at her, his jaw tight. Ain't trying to, just fixin' one part of it. Clara didn't argue further. She just looked at him for a long moment, then swung back onto her horse. You're a fool, Ethan Callahan. But I guess the world needs fools like you. She rode off, leaving him alone with the coming dark. Inside, the girl had fallen asleep again. Her face looked softer in the lamplight, her breathing steadier now. Ethan sat in the chair beside her bed, listening to the night sounds outside, the crickets, the wind in the grass. But beneath it all, faint and far away, he thought he heard something else, the distant rhythm of drums. By morning, Clara's warning proved true. 3 men rode up as Ethan was tending the horses. Tom Avery, Luke, and another rancher named Harland Pierce. Tom swung down first, his face hard. We know she's here, Callahan, he said. Word gets around quick. Ethan straightened. You don't know a damn thing. Luke smirked. Maybe not. But you gonna tell us you didn't drag some half-dead Comanche girl into your house? Harlan spit in the dirt. You think they'll thank you for it? You think they won't come for all of us the minute they find out? Ethan didn't answer. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides. Tom took a step closer. We ain't to skin you to kill her. Just hand her over. Let the army deal with it. You know it's the smart thing. Ethan looked past them out toward the open plains. The wind was still, the sky cloudless. Then he looked back at Tom. No, he said quietly. Tom's jaw tightened. You'll get us all killed. Ethan's voice was steady, almost calm. Maybe, "But I ain't handin' her over." For a long moment, none of them moved. Then Tom spat at the ground, turned, and swung back onto his horse. "This ain't over, Callahan," he said. "Not by a damn sight." They rode off without another word. Ethan stood there, staring after them, knowing full well what he'd just done. That night, as the sun bled into the horizon, the first plume of smoke rose in the distance. And somewhere far away, the war drums grew louder. The days that followed felt like the calm before a storm. Ethan stayed close to the cabin, never letting the girl out of his sight for too long. Her strength was returning little by little. She could sit up now, drink water on her own, even whisper a few words he couldn't understand. Sometimes she would watch him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, maybe, or suspicion. Other times, she'd stare out the window, her jaw tight, as though waiting for something. By the third day, Ethan saw the first sign. Out on the ridge at sunset, a lone rider sat on horseback, silhouetted against the dying light. Too far to make out a face, too still to be just passing through. Ethan stood in the yard, rifle in hand, and watched until the figure finally turned and rode away. The next morning, Clara came riding hard, her boys clinging to the back of the wagon. "They're out there," she said, breathless. "Two scouts came through the north pasture. Didn't take anything, just watched." Ethan nodded. He'd expected as much. "They're comin', Ethan. You can feel it." "I know. You can still fix this. Take her to Fort Mason. Let the army handle it." Ethan glanced back at the cabin, where the girl now sat in the doorway, her blanket draped over her shoulders. "She ain't theirs to handle," he said quietly. Clara shook her head. "Then God help you." By noon, Ethan started preparing for the worst. He moved what little ammunition he had to the table, checked his rifle, his revolver. He filled the water buckets, slaughtered a goat for meat. The girl watched him the whole time. Finally, she rose shakily to her feet, stepped toward him, and placed a hand on his arm. Ethan froze. She pointed to herself, then mimed riding a horse away. "You want me to take you back?" he asked. She didn't understand the words, but she nodded anyway. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "Not now," he said. "Not with them watchin' da." That night, the first war cries echoed faintly through the darkness. Distant, but close enough to carry. Ethan didn't sleep. He sat by the window, rifle across his lap, every muscle tight as a coiled spring. Near dawn, he heard hoofbeats, slow, deliberate. He stepped outside just as the first rider appeared out of the morning mist. Then another, and another. By the time the sun crested the hills, they were everywhere. Dozens of riders, feathers in their hair, rifles slung across their backs. Some wore paint, red streaks across their faces, white handprints on their chests. The lead rider stopped 20 paces from the porch. His horse snorted and pawed at the dirt. Ethan could feel his heart pounding, but he didn't move. The rider lifted a hand, and then Ethan heard it, hoofbeats behind him. He turned slowly. Tom Avery, Luke, Harland, and half a dozen other men from town were riding in from the south, rifles ready, faces grim. Luke called out, "Step aside, Callahan. Let us handle it." The Comanche riders hadn't moved, but their hands hovered near their weapons. Ethan stood in the yard, rifle at his side, caught between two fires. The girl stepped out of the cabin, clutching her blanket tight around her shoulders. The lead Comanche's eyes locked on her. Something passed between them, recognition, maybe, or relief. Ethan felt his throat go dry. He realized, in that moment, that every choice he'd made had led here. This single breath, this single second. Behind him, Tom Avery shouted, "Callahan, move! They'll kill every one of us if you don't." In front of him, the Comanche rider raised his hand higher, a signal Ethan couldn't read. The air felt electric, like the whole world was holding its breath. Ethan knew there was no way to walk out of this without losing something. And then, silence. Only the wind moving through the grass, the creak of saddles, the steady breathing of horses. Somewhere out on the plains, a hawk cried. Ethan's hand tightened on the rifle. He had to choose. The girl moved first. Slowly, she stepped past Ethan, bare feet brushing against the dry grass. Her blanket slipped from her shoulders and fell silently to the ground. The lead rider dismounted, his long braids swaying as he walked toward her. Ethan could see it now, the way she held herself, the way the others watched her. She wasn't just anyone to them. She mattered. The man knelt in front of her, speaking in a low voice. The girl answered, her tone steady but soft, as though giving an order rather than a plea. The Comanche rider turned his gaze toward Ethan. It wasn't anger in his eyes. Not yet. It was something heavier. Behind Ethan, Tom Avery hissed, "Don't trust it. The second she's in their hands, they'll gut us all." Ethan didn't look back. He lowered his rifle just slightly, but enough for everyone to see. The girl turned, meeting Ethan's eyes for the first time in a way that felt deliberate. She pressed a hand to her chest, then to her lips, then held it out toward him. He didn't understand the words she spoke, but he understood the meaning. "Thank you," Tom growled behind him. "For God's sake, Callahan." "Shut up, Tom," Ethan said quietly. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the girl stepped toward the lead rider and took his hand. The man nodded once at Ethan, small but unmistakable. The tension shifted, like a tight rope loosening. But then Luke Avery spat in the dirt and raised his rifle. "To hell with this," Ethan spun. "Luke, don't." Too late. Luke fired. The shot cracked across the plains, echoing like thunder. The bullet missed, kicking up dirt near the rider's feet. But that was enough. The Comanche rifles came up in unison, their movements sharp and fast as lightning. Ethan shoved Luke's rifle down just as the first arrow hissed past his ear and buried itself in the cabin wall. "Stop!" Ethan shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the sudden explosion of sound. Horses screaming, men cursing, the thunder of hooves as the Comanche surged forward. But then, a single voice rang out. The girl. She stood between them all, her hands raised, her voice strong despite her small frame. The riders slowed. The men from town froze. She kept speaking, her words rapid but calm, her eyes locked on the lead riders. The world felt like it was holding its breath again. Finally, the man lowered his rifle. One by one, the other Comanche followed. Tom Avery was breathing hard, his hands trembling around his gun. "What the hell's she sayin'?" he muttered. Ethan didn't answer. The lead rider turned to Ethan and spoke a few words in English, heavily accented but clear. "She says, 'You are not enemy.'" Ethan nodded slowly, lowering his rifle all the way. The rider studied him for another long moment. Then he turned to his people and spoke. They began to ride away, slowly, not in retreat but with purpose, as though something had been settled that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The girl lingered for a moment, her dark eyes locked on Ethan. Content truncated due to size limit. Use line ranges to read in chunks.